So Annie, go ahead and take it away discussing I Saw Death Coming, a history of terror and survival in the War Against Reconstruction, Kadada Williams.
This is the book, if anyone has not read it yet, but I'm hoping people have at least started it. So tonight I'm going to talk about the book, and then I'm going to talk about its primary. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, obviously, and then I'm going to talk about Reconstruction, just to kind of catch everybody up, refresh people on what exactly kind of happened. It's confusing. It's a very complex and nuanced time period in history. And then I kind of thought the best way to do this was to be for us all to just talk about obviously the book and Reconstruction and see what we all think. So has anyone fully read it? Okay. All right, that's fine. The book was published in 2023 and it was longlisted for the National Book Award in Nonfiction. It was shortlisted for the Museum of African American History's Storebook Award. And then it was also got an honorable mention from the National Council on Public History Book Award. I Saw Death Coming takes aim at the argument of the failure of Reconstruction. So, well, for a very long time, and historians are still doing this, they say that kind of the general consensus is that Reconstruction was a failure. And Williams turns this kind of argument on its head, and she says it was not a failure. However, she says that instead of being a failure, Reconstruction was a war on freedom, and it was waged on newly freed Blacks by whites intent on denying equality. So she basically argues that Reconstruction didn't fail, but it was overthrown instead by white violence. Williams then goes on to state that she says that using failure as a measure of Reconstruction disregards the degree to which white supremacists in the South intentionally worked to dismantle freedoms that Black Americans sought and achieved. So I Saw Death Coming. So she does start where she begins with examining how Black families moved out of slavery, what their lives looked like in freedom. So, there's often this argument that, right, enslaved people were able to still grasp onto their humanity by being able to get married. They were able to do certain things that whites could also do. And there's also the argument that, oh, if you were enslaved, there were some people who were enslaved were maybe treated better than others, but she kind of delves into this by looking at all of the things that came with freedom and how Black families set up their lives. They were able to, they had the right to marry who they wanted to. They had independent family homes. They were able to chart their own family's course. They were able to secure dignified work and reap the rewards of one's labor, acquire land, open a business, or work from home. They were able to accumulate wealth and property and attend school. She also says that freedom is going to create a new constellation of possibilities for African Americans, and they quickly pulled the levers of power to make their new world a reality. So she starts this kind of, again, she starts the book talking about what freedom looked like for Black families, how they're going to create this. The main kind of focus of this book is through a pretty narrow lens of looking at violence reaped upon Black families in the South during Reconstruction. But it's through, obviously, again, the focus of the family and how that impacted formerly enslaved people, and then how that trauma kind of continued to impact their lives through future generations. The book also offers a detailed description of the ways in which Black people were attacked, most of them in their own homes. Most of it was extreme acts of violence, which we all know about. And most of these acts of violence were carried out by people within their own community that people knew, right? They all knew each other. And so what she does is she is going to look at these stories through firsthand accounts. Most of these chapters are going to be firsthand accounts taken from in 1871, Congress does actually do an investigation into the Klan, and they interview some pretty brave people who come out and they do speak to Congress about their experiences, about the violence that occurred. And so Williams is going to take these testimonies and she uses their own words to tell these stories. She also does take some narratives from the WPA narratives that were collected in the 1930s with the New Deal. We obviously know that some of those narratives are flawed. They were skewed a little bit depending on who people were talking to or based on various recollections from the people who were being interviewed. So one thing that is important to remember, obviously paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan, they're going to make Reconstruction resistance more organized after 1867. The KKK is formed in 1865 in Tennessee. By 1867, they are going to, between 1865 1867, they're going to see more violence at voting booths. You're going to see more violence being carried out in public. However, by about 1867, the KKK becomes more organized. They're more widespread throughout the South. And that's when she starts to say that that's when they start primarily targeting people, families in their homes at night. So they call them night rides. And that's when they're carrying out these pretty extreme acts of violence. Most of these acts of violence we obviously know is because Black men get the right to vote and enslaved people are now freed. Many Black families were poised to transcend slavery, but white people sought to prevent them from doing so by intentionally targeting their homes and bodies. We see this. This is obviously, again, the main focus of this book. The Williams argues that this violence was genocidal-like, and that examining the evolution of this relentless campaign of violence brings the shadow army that waged war on American freedom and democracy more fully into view. Hardliners attacked Black voters and office holders at the polls and political meetings, but they usually preferred to ambush families at home. And they also attacked women and children just as often as they did men. Williams cautions against making broad statements about how much resistance was possible in these situations. We know that there are some naysayers, right, that say that formerly enslaved people could have just fought back. Clearly not the case. She does talk about, a lot of families who are ambushed, they're attacked, people barging into their homes. A lot of them thought that if they just complied with what was being asked, then they would have been left alone. Sometimes that did happen, but a lot of times it did not. Williams also focuses on the violence experienced by women. There's a chapter where she talks about, men feeling like the knock on the door is for them, and so they go and hide, and the women are the ones who are going to have to deal with the violence that's being wrought out in their home. So I Saw Death Coming is an account of what Black people accomplished, lost, and fought for in gaining their freedom. Williams describes what it was like to live through and with the violence and then its resulting trauma that's going to last, obviously, we know, throughout generations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Reconstruction era, just to refresh everyone's memory. And then I thought we could discuss the book and Reconstruction as a whole. I know that not everyone has finished the book or read the book yet. So I thought that I wanted to talk about Reconstruction just again, so we could get kind of a better discussion from the content. So the Reconstruction era refers to the period between 1865 and 1877, obviously following the Civil War. We know that plans and discussions on how to readmit Southern states in rebellion back into the Union are going to begin in Congress in 1863. So Lincoln goes to Congress and he says, what are we going to do? Here are some questions we need to figure out. So some of these questions that Reconstruction is going to seek to address: how would the states be reunited? What would the status of the states be that had seceded? Should Confederate leaders be tried for treason? Should Confederates have their citizenship restored? At whose expense should the South's economy be rebuilt, and how? And then the bigger question I think that they're trying to address is how to handle freed slaves? Will they be given citizenship? Will they be given the right to vote? There was some discussion actually on reimbursing plantation owners for the cost of their slaves. There was also a question on whether or not, for a little short period of time during the beginning of Reconstruction, there was a lot of conversations about giving formerly enslaved people land. Obviously, very complex questions. I do not. I would not want to be a part of these conversations because I think that they would be really hard to figure out the answers to, especially, you know, how do you bring these states back into the Union, and how do you bring the South back in, knowing that the government is going to have to oversee a complete overhaul and change in a political and social landscape and economic landscape, with the freeing of enslaved people. So emancipation does wipe out $4 billion in the Southern economy. That is estimated to be the value of in, in the total amount of enslaved people in the South in around 1860. Now, Google AI said between 2.7 and 3.7 billion. A textbook I have that was written in about 2012 said it was 4 billion. So I'm going to go with the scholar and not Google AI, and say it was about $8 billion. To put some of that into perspective, around 1860, the dollar value of enslaved Blacks outstripped the value of all banks, railroads, and factories combined in the entire United States. So we're talking about a lot of money and a lot of, obviously, investment into this economy that the government is now going to have to figure out what to do. You've got people who are an entire portion of the country that has seceded based on wanting to keep enslaved people. You fought a devastating war, and now the federal government's going to have to figure out how to bring these states back into the Union and do so peacefully. The defeat of the Confederacy, obviously, we know it's going to transform Southern society. Not only is there going to have to be, they're going to have to rebuild physically, in terms of spaces, building cities and towns, but now you also have to transform their social structures with this change in economic status, I guess. We obviously know that the South is a plantation economy and that they did not have very many factories. They did not have many railroads. Most of what they had was destroyed during the Civil War. You also are going to see during this time period, power is going to be reoriented from Southern landholders to Northern industrialists. So Southern landholders, we obviously know antebellum era, Southern landholders have a ton of power in the United States. They control a lot of the country's wealth, a lot of the exports leaving this country, cotton. And then, so you're going to see this shift during Reconstruction. It's very clearly going to shift from the South. Now power is going to be really more orchestrated and concentrated in the North. So it's an adjustment. The Reconstruction period is also going to apply to the rebuilding of the nation and integration of former Confederate states back into the Union. And Reconstruction is going to focus on the attempts of the federal government made to address the inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy. So Lincoln, like I said, he goes to Congress around 1863 and says, we need to start coming up with a plan of what to do and how we're going to handle the Southern states being reunited and coming back into the Union. Lincoln has several recommendations. Obviously, we know that he's going to be assassinated before the official end of the war. However, his plan, he's actually fairly lenient on the South. So his plan is a 10% plan. 10% of former Confederates have to basically take an oath of allegiance to the Union, and poof, you're back in. It's not that different from what Andrew Johnson wants. However, the only exception really between the two is how to treat the freedmen. Lincoln does float the idea he does say maybe we should give freedmen some rights. Maybe we should give them, he is floating the idea of potentially giving Black men the vote. However, really not fully fleshed out at the time that he's assassinated. So you have two periods of Reconstruction. Again, this is all incredibly nuanced and complex. So I'm giving you guys just a brief refresh so that way we can have a really good discussion on Reconstruction and the book. Presidential Reconstruction is going to be from 1865 to 1867. This is obviously under President Andrew Johnson. Johnson is going to offer pardons to all Southern whites except Confederate leaders and wealthy planters. Now, it is important to note that they do eventually get a pardon down the road. So wealthy planters were not given a blanket pardon, but a lot of them individually did get pardons. State governments were required to abolish slavery and repudiate secession, but they were primarily kind of free to enact the laws as they pleased. So not super harsh. They are required to take an oath of allegiance and then, oh, yeah, you're back. I think it would be super weird to think about the fact that, Congress in 1866, you've got Southern whites strolling back in. And, a lot of them took their old seats back. So you've got Alexander Stephens, who's the VP of the Confederacy. He becomes a congressman and he's a senator and he just walks right back into the Capitol and takes his old seat back. And, I just think it's very odd that you have, and again, maybe this all comes down to whether or not you think that the South were traitors or not, but it is strange. We're probably the only country that has a revolution of sorts, a civil war, obviously. And we just the United States just allows these people to just come right back. And so what happens is because Southern governments are pretty much given a lot of leeway under presidential Reconstruction, Southern states enact black codes. This is obviously going to limit freedmen's options and reestablish a plantation society under these black codes. So there's a lot of kind of reorienting, a lot of questions here because Lincoln is assassinated when he is. Reconstruction, again, is not fully fleshed out by the time the war ends. Andrew Johnson is from Tennessee. He's obviously very lenient towards the South, and he is favorable to them. And so he kind of just says, let's just let everybody back, and that would all be great. The Civil Rights Act, Mom, put yourself on mute. There we go. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is passed, obviously during presidential Reconstruction, but it is passed over Johnson's veto. So it does establish the legal and social status of newly freed African Americans, and it does lay the groundwork for the Reconstruction amendments that are going to come. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1866, this is actually really interesting. It is the first federal law that defines citizenship and affirms that all citizens are equally protected by the law. Now, before this, citizenship had previously been defined by states. So state law kind of dictated who is technically a citizen. And so the Civil Rights Act is going to pave the way for the Civil Rights Amendments or Reconstruction Amendments. And then it does kind of put the idea of citizenship under federal law, that the federal government can decide and put a definition on who is a citizen and who is not. Andrew Johnson is going to be impeached. He's going to, Trump and Clinton are going to follow in his footsteps. He is impeached in the House, but not in the Senate, so he does stay in office. So he is impeached in 1868. He's impeached in the House for violating the Tenure of Office Act. So the Tenure of Office Act is in 1867. Congress does pass an act in 1867 because they are frustrated and annoyed by Johnson because Johnson is not doing what the Republicans in Congress want him to do. He, again, I think it's important to note that Johnson was picked by Lincoln to run with him in 64 because he's from Tennessee. They thought it would be a bit of an olive branch. He apparently, in his VP speech, in 1864, he was drunk and barely coherent, which really annoyed Lincoln. And so he's just kind of not really doing what Congress wants in terms of Reconstruction. And so the House says you have violated the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act is put into place, saying that it requires Congress to approve the removal of certain government officials, particularly cabinet members. And again, they're doing this to try to hinder Johnson. Johnson walks right into the trap, and he is going to try to remove Edwin Stanton, who at that time was the Secretary of War. And so the House says, okay, we are now going to bring charges of impeachment against you. He is acquitted in the Senate by one vote. So John Quincy Adams is actually that one vote, and he has a chapter in JFK's Profiles in Courage due to that vote. Which I think if you have not read Profiles in Courage, highly recommend it. That chapter in particular is very interesting. So Johnson is impeached. At this point, he loses a lot of his power. Congress is then going to say, okay, we are now back in control of Reconstruction. The next phase of Reconstruction is going to be radical Reconstruction. And this really kind of starts around 1867. Keep in mind, too, that Northern voters are tired of Johnson. They don't really like Johnson at this point. They're also tired. We just fought a 4-year war. We're really tired of all the shenanigans going on in the South, and we're just kind of over it. And so what happens is Congress takes control back of Reconstruction. They're going to pass the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which is going to divide the South into 5 military districts. UNC. North Carolina is District 2. And they basically they bring in the military, and the military is going to occupy the southern states to try to enforce Reconstruction and enforce the laws coming down through Congress. So they are going to occupy the South until 1877. I feel like it's not really talked about enough that, we had occupation zones. We had troops who had fought in Gettysburg. They literally come in and they occupy the South and try to enforce what is going on and try to enforce, obviously, the freedoms that were granted to the formerly enslaved, and they're going to try to get Southerners back in line. Support for Reconstruction is going to gradually wane, so oh, surprise, Americans lose interest. And so Americans start to lose interest. And so the support for Reconstruction is going to start to go by the wayside. Some of this is due to an economic recession. There is a panic of 1873, which is pretty catastrophic for the economy. And then there's kind of this general feeling that Reconstruction is not meeting its intended goals. There's obviously overt racism in the North and the South. The North decides, you know what, this is kind of exhausting. We're tired of dealing with this. We're tired of hearing about the violence going on. And maybe we shouldn't really get involved in this anymore. Northerners are tired of the South. And they're also tired of defending Black citizens. And so they're also, again, this is when violence in the South is really coming to a head. By about 1867 is when it kind of starts kind of climbing this hill. And then by 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted back into the Union. They've taken their loyalty oath. They have added the 14th Amendment into state constitutions, and they're all back into the Union, and most of them are going to be controlled by the Republican Party. Republican Party at this point is the party of Lincoln, and the parties flip back in the 1960s. So at this point, Republicans would be what we would consider a liberal. And by 1870, most of the state governments are being run by these quote unquote liberal Republicans. However, this is going to flip back again by the late 1870s. So Republicans are going to lose power. Republican Party at this point in time are primarily getting Black votes. So they're being supported by Black voters, those who were able to vote at this point, and then they're going to be supported by what Southerners would say are carpetbaggers, which obviously are going to be Northerners who've come down to the South. They'd be supported by other various groups, but at this point in time, most wealthy former plantation owners would have been Democrats. And so they're going to kind of come back into power in the later 1870s. Cotton and tobacco harvests are going to take about 15 years to slowly bounce back. I think in order to look at Reconstruction, we also need to just get an idea of how just decimated the South is. The North is going to come into a completely destroyed South, and they have a lot that they need to accomplish, right? So you've got these 4 million formerly enslaved people who the government has to figure out how they're going to safely get them supported and on their feet and back. It's not just, I think a lot of times the way that people think of it is, oh, now they're free. Well, there's a lot of work that has to be done and federal support, government support that needs to be done in order to get people on their feet and safe and protected. Because we obviously know what's going to happen is former plantation owners are going to strike a lot of deals, right? So they go to the formerly enslaved and they say, "Oh, I have a lot of land that needs to be farmed. I'll trade you. I'll let you live on my property if you farm this certain plot, but I'm going to take out, XYZ. You're going to have to pay me for your harvest. You're going to have to pay me for giving you your property. You're going to have to pay me for all these things, right? So then it becomes slavery by another name. And so they're tenant farmers. And so there's a lot that the federal government has to get into. So the cotton and tobacco harvest, again, from 1860 is a boom year in the South. They have one of the best harvests that they've ever had. They also, in terms of cotton and tobacco, from what I understand, it was the biggest harvest, I think, maybe in history. And it takes till the late 1870s for the cotton and tobacco industry to kind of bounce back to producing what they had been numbers that they had been producing in the 1850s. So what happens is that you have the Compromise of 1877, which is going to see the end of Reconstruction with the removal of troops from the South. So what happens is Rutherford B. Hayes, he comes up with the Compromise of 1877. In order to get elected, he says, "I will remove federal troops from the South." And people say, "Sold, that sounds great." And so that kind of troops leave, and that's about it. It is important to note that the legacy of Reconstruction, the positives, obviously, is that 4 million people are freed. It ends slavery. We obviously know the Civil War, it does end slavery, but people are now free. And Reconstruction also, you're going to see the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. It's established in 1865 in order to provide services like food, housing, medical care, and education to newly freed slaves. You're going to see some of this. You see it directly in Hillsborough. If you guys have ever been to Dickerson Chapel, it had been a school for the formerly enslaved children and adults. And so if you go into that building, you can just imagine, I mean, the Quakers ended up purchasing that building, and they run a school out of there in the late 1860s, early 1870s, but they are kind of connected with the Freedmen's Bureau. And then this is all part of Reconstruction. The Quakers who came down, who purchased that school, were from the North. And again, they're carpetbaggers, but they do a lot of good. Reconstruction amendments, obviously very positive, and these are amendments we still talk about. So 13th Amendment is going to abolish slavery. 14th Amendment is going to give citizenship to all people born in the United States. This is something that is being challenged by the Trump administration currently, right? Likely going to go to the Supreme Court. Well, it's going to go to the Supreme Court at some point to kind of quantify and qualify what people born in the US, what does that actually mean? But the foundation of that amendment is from Reconstruction, and is to give formerly enslaved and Black people citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment is going to give all men the right to vote. Obviously, they're doing that to include Black men, and then we also know that a lot of bad stuff comes out of that. There's going to be a lot of repression of the vote. It is important to note that with Reconstruction, the first year or two, it's not all bad. So Reconstruction does have some success. You are going to see really kind of at the beginning, there are a few Black men who are able to hold office. You are also going to see um, Black men were voting. It's really kind of around, and this is what Williams says in her book. It's really around the creation, kind of the stranglehold of the KKK, that's when you kind of see things start to shift. But in the first really beginning of Reconstruction, you've got the Freedmen's Bureau that comes in. They are successful. They do start schools. They do educate. They are helping with housing. They are helping with all sorts of things in the South with these freed Blacks. But then things are going to kind of get turned on its head as people get back on their, when I say people, former plantation owners kind of get back on their feet. Poor whites kind of get angrier and angrier and angrier. And then you're going to kind of, and more violence kind of comes about. And so that's when kind of things kind of start making Reconstruction, I would say, a failure. Negative legacy, obviously, of Reconstruction is you're going to see the emergence of the KKK. It's going to lead to widespread voter suppression, grandfather clauses, black codes, which then is going to lead to Jim Crow. You have widespread segregation, and obviously the lost cause narrative emerges out of Reconstruction. You've got a time period, you have obviously the Civil War, you've got Reconstruction, which is the overall goal is to allow the Confederacy to come back. And then you're also, the federal government is trying to kind of reorient freed slaves into society. But then out of that, you've got 10 years later, Reconstruction ends, and then you've got these stupid monuments going up that are kind of harkening back to the quote unquote glory days of the South. So the lost cause narrative does emerge out of Reconstruction. And we obviously know that this still is kind of this narrative that is still running rampant in the South today among some communities. Ongoing legacy of Reconstruction, reparations debate, right? So unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction. So they voted on this in California. And there was a lot of talk under Biden about what to do and whether or not there would be reparations for formerly enslaved ancestors. Now, what I do think is interesting is that originally Lincoln threw out the idea of reparations going to wealthy plantation owners, right? So he said the government will pay people for the cost that they lost with freeing slaves. And now the discussion about reparations is now kind of come full circle, and it's the conversation is about paying people who were formerly enslaved. The civil rights movement obviously is going to come out of Reconstruction, right? So the failures of Reconstruction, the civil rights movement is going to emerge because Reconstruction doesn't meet the full aims, right? So Black people don't get equal rights with Reconstruction, which was one of the primary goals. And then the Reconstruction, oh, I lost my place. I'm so sorry. And then you're also going to see Reconstruction amendments, right? So like I said, the 14th Amendment is still openly debated. I'm very curious how the Supreme Court is going to rule on this, because since its passage, our country has fully gone by that anyone born in this country, whether your parents are citizens or not, you are a citizen. Overall, Reconstruction is going to see the abolition of slavery, the establishment of equal protection under the law, and it's going to increase opportunities for Black men to vote and hold political office. It is important to note that I would be, I think, remiss if I did not mention W.E.B. Du Bois and his argument with Reconstruction. If you have not read this book, it is obviously very lengthy. I had to read this when I was in grad school, but clearly, if you see on my, I clearly had a lot of points that I thought were important in it. So he does view Reconstruction as a period of immense potential for democracy and racial equality, but his argument is that Reconstruction fails due to racism and economic exploitation. So I do want to open this up because I want to hear what everybody thinks. And I'm going to go kind of with more general questions again, since I don't think everyone has finished the book. But I guess my first question would be, do we agree with Williams's argument that Reconstruction was not a failure, but was overthrown by white violence?
Hmm.
And I guess that also would beg the question of, first of all, do we think that Reconstruction was a failure?
Right. That's why I was like,
Yeah, I know. It's a hard question because I think you guys go ahead and
Yeah.
It's kind of hard for without having read the book, but
yeah.
it's obviously it didn't succeed at with the objectives that people had. So I would say it's a failure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that um mostly that it is a failure, but I also think it's a failure by design. That's the best way I can put my thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My question, I think, is too, I mean, so it fails because of violence, but why would the government have not expected violence to begin with? Right? So it seems like there's
Yeah.
no plan with the
Yeah.
federal government to account for the fact that, of course, there's going to be violence. There was just 4 years of a devastating war
Yeah.
because of this issue and over slavery and enslaved people. And so I guess I've always thought it strange that the federal government didn't seem, they seem to be kind of thrown by, oh my gosh, whites aren't happy that now formerly enslaved people are equal to them.
Well, your reference to legislators uh, from the South just taking their places back in Washington, I would that to me suggests confirms what Beverly is saying. If you're gonna create an environment like that in Washington, it could not have succeeded.
Right.
I think it makes more sense if you think about what the North's motive was, or why they wanted to end slavery. And you talked about it some, as far as like the wealth that the South had amassed and the power that they were wielding at that time. And the North knew that if they could get rid of slavery, they were going to, cut that power down, and then they would become more powerful, more wealthy. And so I've never looked at the North as like um, starting the Civil War out of some um, humanitarian issue. I think it was definitely a power move for them. And so if you look at it from that point of view, then you understand why they didn't have the stomach to, do what needed to be done to suppress the violence in the South. They didn't care about the Black people.
Yeah. Grant now in Grant's defense. So Johnson leaves office, Grant comes in, and he does for a little while, he is able to suppress some of this violence. So he does come in and he does um kind of with when the military is also occupying the South. Um there you do see kind of some of this violence goes down a bit. But then Grant gets kind of caught up in other stuff. I mean, you've got this economic depression or recession that's going on in 1873. So there's other stuff that comes about, and also the kind of this kind of building up towards the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age just kind of starts taking off in the 1870s. And so he is able to a little bit, and also with this investigation done by Congress in 1871 of the KKK. The KKK is established. I think they are like kind of defined as a terrorist group, which is important because it kind of allows in the federal government to say that if a group is like hindering someone else's rights, then the government can step in. That is a crime. But what is kind of interesting about this investigation that Congress did, it did have Southern support for it. And apparently there were Southern senators who were on, it was a joint committee, and the Southern senators wanted to be on the committee because they wanted to kind of control what the investigation obviously was going to find. And because the Congress had heard about complaints of all the violence and all this. And so, but there are some results with that. KKK violence does go down a little bit in the South around this kind of investigation time. And then obviously we know it's going to ramp back up. But
And I'm not saying there weren't like true abolitionists who thought that way. Of course there were, but I'm just saying I think that overall, I think it was a power move from the North more than a humanitarian effort on their part. I just don't give them that much credit. And I think when you see the Republican Party, pushing for Black men to vote, it is again another power move. They want to ensure that Black people are going to be, part of their voting bloc.
they're voting for them. So yeah, they definitely want them
So, I mean, again, it's not, they're not doing it, because, of good reasons. It's another power move. And so I don't, when I look at that period, the white people, all of them, North and South, just did not care about the welfare. Sorry, my son is calling me over and over. Did not care about what the Black citizens needed, or what they needed to do to help them accomplish and to get true equality. Oh my gosh! Sorry.
I think that well, 4 or 5 things. First of all, Annie, that was an absolutely wonderful review of Reconstruction. I could have sent you over to Hillside High School to a class of seniors, and they would have.
I was going to do a PowerPoint, but then I was like, I'm talking to friends.
Yeah, but they would have come away knowing something. I think first of all, we have to actually go back to the late 1850s, 1860s. Reconstruction was a huge failure. I don't know what kind of terminology you want to use, but in essence, as already been pointed out, Gerald made a point. Grant has already made a point about that. Annie also echoed that essentially what they set out to do was not achieved. So if you don't achieve what you set out to do, then it's a failure. But I take it back to the late 1850s. The problem with the Civil War was that the war was not fought to end slavery. Now understand that slavery was the central cause of the war. It was the hub around which all of those sub-causes existed. So slavery was the central cause of the war, but it wasn't fought to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln let us know that in his Emancipation Proclamation. But even before the Emancipation Proclamation was written and issued on September 17th, 1862, issued to go into effect January 1st, 1863. Do you know how much money had been appropriated by the United States Congress during the summer of 1862 to get rid of Black people? We're talking about in 1862, $1.5 million being appropriated by the government to actually send freed Blacks in Washington, D.C., in Philadelphia, in New York, wherever they were in the United States. We are begging and pleading for you all to leave this country and settle in Haiti, settle in Liberia, settle in Panama, but just leave the United States. So you have a government that's already complicit. They are actually saying that we don't want you here. And the person leading that charge is Abraham Lincoln. On August 17th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln invited 5 Black leaders from Washington, D.C. And the man who invited them was his immigration officer. They should have told Black folk who were invited what the deal was. The immigration officer invited these men to the White House. And Mr. Lincoln tells them that, we're not equal. You're Black, we're white. We're not equal, and there's no way we can coexist in this country together. So it means that we've already appropriated $1.5 million to get you out of this country. So go back and tell your people that essentially we want y'all to migrate. Very, very much what is happening in the country today. We want you to leave the country. And as soon as, and if, we come around to the ending of slavery, because what has he already said? I'll do whatever it takes to bring the nation back together again. If it takes freeing no slaves, I'll do that. If it takes freeing some and leaving others, I'll do that. If it takes freeing all of them, whatever it takes to bring the nation back together again is what is paramount here. It has nothing to do with them. And then you issue an Emancipation Proclamation on September 17th, telling the South that you have 100 days to put down your weapons. And let's just say that on December 1st, 1862, Southerners would have surrendered. What would have been the course of slavery? So the Emancipation Proclamation has nothing to do with the ending of slavery. It has to do with Mr. Lincoln and Northerners telling Southerners that I got power over you. And what did Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis say? This fool is crazy. I mean, it's just like it's just like somebody telling, like any president anywhere today telling, the President Trump telling the Canadian Prime Minister what to do, or telling somebody in an African nation what to do. He had no power over these folks. And so you have the United States of America and the Confederate States of America, two independent nations. And you can't tell me to end slavery. And then within the document itself, you are going to free half the folks in North Carolina and leave the other ones in slavery. So if the Southerners had surrendered on December 1st, 1862, slavery would not have come to an end. We understand that. So we have a government who ain't about the business of freedom. It's about the business of trying to, who wants to be president of the United States in a civil war where you are divided? So this man is doing everything in his powers to pull the nation back together again. So with that in mind, how a lot happens between 1862 and 1865 that brings Lincoln into different corners. When you look at his messages and his papers, you can see the conflict that he has. He's fighting himself and he's fighting others, and he comes around by January of 1865, saying that indeed we do need a 13th Amendment. An executive order is not going to do this. So by the time he dies, he is still pushing the immigration game. But he is also saying that we need a document, we need an amendment to end slavery. So with that lack of support for real emancipation, real freedom, you have a situation where Northerners, for the most part, as Brandy pointed out, are not in support of total freedom, pulling people in totality, making them first-class citizens of the United States. And because of that, because of a lack of an infrastructure in place in 1859 and 1860 to decide what would be the future of people if they are freed. because that is not there, we are where we are today in 2025 because of that. And so by the time we get to 1865 and this thing comes to an end, and you got the Freedmen's Bureau there that is of some benefit. But in the main, people, the 4 million people in the South are just out there hanging, except for the support that they give themselves. The Black church emerges, fraternal organizations emerge, private organizations emerge in the Black community, people coming down from the North. But essentially, the federal government, except for legislation, and then in 1877, they turned their backs. And then the United States Supreme Court in 1883 sets the tone for what is to come for 70 to 80 years, all the way down to 1965. So essentially, if we're going to blame anybody, you can blame the government, the federal government, for not doing what they should have done. I mean, if you're going to blame anybody, it was the federal government that allowed for the existence of slavery. They put it in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 9, Article 4, Section 2. So it's the federal government that allowed for all of this. I mean, you have a situation on January 6, 2021 that manifests itself when this man becomes president in January, that is just like what happened at the end of the Civil War, where you pardoned, all of these people. And so essentially the beat kind of goes on. I did a session for the Case Scholars today, and one of their questions was, are we losing our democracy? I don't want to be flippant, but my philosophy is that we have not attained. You're on the avenue, you're on the road to democracy, but folks will say we're losing our democracy. Well, no, you haven't gotten there yet. And there are stumbling blocks and hurdles to attaining it. It just so happens that you got a fool who was elected and who's there now, who is doing everything in his powers to make this nation carry out the oligarchy that it has been. Folks say we're becoming an oligarchy. We've always been an oligarchy. When you look at the fact that there are 535 people in Congress and 265 of them are millionaires and billionaires. When you look at the writing of the Constitution in 1787, and all 55 men were wealthy, 5 people from North Carolina, 3 of them slave owners, 1 of them had more than 50 slaves. So people who have run this country have always been wealthy. In 1890, you got senators lighting their cigars with $10 bills. So we've always had this oligarchy, and we've always been on this road to democracy. And we've had elements and continue to have elements of an autocracy in this country. And so my thing is that the reason we are where we are today is because the federal government didn't do what the hell it was supposed to have done from the outset. It allowed the states to do what they wanted to do. People a few years ago said we should stop reading newspapers that accepted advertisements for runaway slaves, and for those newspapers that accepted advertisements for the sale. Well, the government allowed for that. And so in a so-called free enterprise system, you're going to do whatever it takes to make money. Only the government itself can put, those bars up to keep people from expressing their ids, to the very, very max. And I'll get off my soapbox. Somebody else talk.
I'll jump in here very quickly if I can. I'm in total agreement with everything that you just said. And I think the reason the federal government, going back to what Brandy was saying, that they didn't get involved to change things. They didn't have any incentive to, because as you said, it was all, and both of you, the money and the power. But I did want to add in there, just in terms of the timeline that you were talking about, and a person and a fact that gets completely ignored, lost to history, is General Hunter. And he gets put in charge for the Union of the Division of the South. And in 1862, he actually issues General Order number 11, declaring that all the slaves in the states in which he has taken over are free. And Lincoln says, no, you don't. And he rescinds that offer, that order. And 6 months later comes out with the Emancipation Proclamation, which doesn't do, kind of half as much or go as far as General Hunter's order did. And it's just amazing to me that General Hunter never, ever gets talked about. Ken Burns, had 7 or 8 episodes and all those letters and never mentions General Hunter. And he was a complex figure, but it was put out there. And if the North had wanted to do something in terms of ending slavery, it was right there a lot earlier than the Emancipation Proclamation.
If I can't, Dr. Parker, is it okay if I say? Hello? Oh, okay. I see. I couldn't lost the screen for a moment. Great stuff. I had to step out for a minute, but good stuff and good breakdown of a book that I am including in my dissertation in some form or fashion. You mentioned something personally when you said you're glad you weren't a part of that, or you didn't want to. It was hard for you to process being a part of the discussions or the things that taking place during that period of time. But just 2 things. The one thing is, it's got to be off with their heads. The example was not set to deter the behaviors that persisted after Reconstruction, that Black folks in this country had to endure after Reconstruction, because there was no real punishment for these people who dissented from the nation, the Union. So yeah, needed to be harsher punishment, extreme harsh punishment that was not carried out. And we would have a different lens to look through this history had that taken place, instead of the rush to reconciliation amongst the white folks. But something I want to bring up because of Dr. Parker's comments on Lincoln. I find Lincoln to be very fascinating as a historical figure. And I often, Dr. Parker, you probably heard me mention this, I often put him in conversation with Malcolm X, because they're in process in a significant way for a significant period of time, and then they're assassinated. They're witnessed historically as transfers of significance in how they're thinking and how they're moving, and we don't get to see how they finish because they're taken away. But that is one of the dynamics I'm often appreciative of a Lincoln and a Malcolm X, is how significant at the moment of their assassinations, they're in some type of transition that is public and easily accessible when you look at their the documents that they're and the things that they're engaged at that point in time. So yeah, I often think about putting them in conversation in some type of historical way in a work of something. But yeah, good stuff. Appreciative of this as always.
Annie, just before Horace comes on,
Yeah.
Felton, after Horace makes his comments, can you share with us the general, an abstract essentially of your dissertation because it covers this period?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And a fantastic presentation as usual. It's spotless. About a month and a half ago, Dr. Parker had another seminar, one of these things we do, and there was a gentleman on there, a professor of history, I believe, from Greensboro, Dr. Parker, and I asked him what he thought the state of democracy was now, given that right in front of our very faces, the one thing that everybody prided themselves on in this country was democracy and the right to vote, everybody being treated equally. But now we have a government, apparently, that the law only applies to people who are not GOP or not like Trump, and people who are people of color, people who are Democrats, are just, the law to Trump is just a thought. It's not something he has to follow. My concern is, where do we go from here? What happens now? I stay in touch with a lot of social media, and I see people are arming themselves. Other groups are coming together, because I don't think democracy is going to be the same after this particular presidency. I think that we've been shown, it was told at the very beginning of the Constitution, 3/5 of a human being, they don't really care what we think about. Everybody said that tonight. They don't consider us human beings. And now we have a guy who's breaking the law, 34 felons. I can assure you, this wouldn't have gotten that far had it been Barack Obama or Beverly Scarlett running for president, doing those things that these people are doing. But I'm wondering now, how is this fixed? My other concern is the only way to fix this, civil rights has proven throughout history, is that the only time people start taking notice is when the other side starts taking losses. When those boys went down to Mississippi, were killed in the bus, people started talking about, let's try to work this out. When white people started getting killed and the numbers started rising, then it got in front of the heavy hitters who made decisions to stop that because they didn't want to turn on each other. And right now, the biggest problem we have is that they're afraid of each other. The Proud Boys, the Ku Klux Klan, and how many of these white supremacist groups that are rising now and being blatant, they're not even wearing masks anymore. And I saw something today where the government is hiring bounty hunters to go after illegal immigrants, paying them $1,500 to $1,000 for everyone they pick up. So this is not going to go away easily. It's good to talk about it, but I'm going to tell you this. My gut feeling is we need to prepare for the assault on the census, because I don't know how else we get out of this mess, and I don't know how they correct it. But Andy, that was a great presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I guess my thing, Horace, building on that, is my concern is just this idea that, I mean, we have a president and then people who believe him, he can just say, that's not true. I mean,
Yeah,
look what's going on right now with what happened on Saturday night, right? Where we bombed nuclear sites in Iran. And originally Trump came out and said we obliterated these sites and Iran is never going to get a nuclear weapon because we've taken care of all of it. And now we have intelligence. No one else corroborated that anyway. I mean, all these other countries have come out and said Israel is the only country that has said that Iran was weeks away from creating a nuclear weapon. Everyone else, our former allies, the UK and France and Canada, they've all said that they were years away. And then it came out that they weren't damaged quite as much as they claimed, and it actually just set them back a few weeks, possibly. And all Trump has to do right now is say, that's not true, fake news, fake news, fake news. And people, I mean, I, I, I don't know why I enrage myself, but I do follow the conservative Reddit board, and just because I'm very curious. These people, I mean, whatever Trump says, they will just follow him into the fire. And I don't know how people combat that. Because all Republicans right now have to do is just say, you're biased or you're this or no. And then you have all the evidence. I mean, again, with you know, with what happened on Saturday, the evidence is that no. I mean, they have pictures of Iran with trucks outside these nuclear facilities days before we bombed them. And it's likely they got all of this uranium out of there anyway. And so it didn't even matter. And so it's just like, you have all this evidence facing you to the contrary of what Trump is saying, and people just don't care. And I just, that's so damaging and so disheartening. And it's like, how can half this country has lost their ever-loving minds and can't think rationally? It's why, I mean, and maybe it's not weird to think, because I think this country, half the population has lost their minds maybe throughout all of history. But it's just bizarre to me that, you know, with social media, I mean, you can look up anything on this device right here and get an answer, and people just believe what they want to believe,
I
according to
think
me.
they created a new DEI, the divisive, excluded, and indoctrinated. That's
Yeah.
what they're running to that other side. They're making them feel like that's what is happening to them. So they're using DEI to recruit them, but they have a different definition of it.
Yeah.
Well, and the sorry, I was going to say the common denominator here is hate. With the Reconstruction and what happened and the violence then and what's happening now, it's so easy to motivate people by fear and hatred, and that to me is what just the most tragic part of it all is just how easy it is, for people, and oftentimes in the name of a religion that's all about love.
Yeah.
No?
That's an excellent point, Courtney. I couldn't agree more.
I would argue that the common denominator is hypocrisy. There's a willfulness to find common ground and commonality amongst the parties on matters that are not the concerns of their populace, and the populace has been loudly ever since Reconstruction, ever since after for the government to be of service to the people it purports to be. And we're at a point where everybody's feeling it. And we're at a point where I don't remove any blame from the Democrats for allowing it to get to this place, because they have dressed themselves as the party of the people. And they have not carried themselves in a manner that is totally without high scrutiny. And this slow walk towards a president with the powers that we are disgusted by Trump having has been the walk of all of these other presidential participants. And we've just reached a point where it's somebody who is on the side of unhinged more than not. But this thing was lockstep with both parties. They both knew that at points presidents haven't had to ask Congress for permission to engage in warlike things since the 60s, I believe. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's been an action. They've been doing stuff without approval from Congress. But when the guy we don't like does it, now we got to fix it. It's too late.
I don't think we've declared war since what? World War II?
That might be the case. Maybe the 50s, right? Or 40s, 50s. But it's been a ridiculous.
World War II.
Yeah, it's been a ridiculous amount of time. The War Department is now the Defense Department. Change terminology, make it work better for the people so they feel different or better, whatever the case may be. I'm sorry, didn't want to drone on, but exactly. That's my point. So if you are okay, I can just kind of spitball this, so I'm not taking up all the air, but I won't read the total project description, but my objective of my dissertation, which the proposal was just approved, and Dr. Parker's on that committee, which is probably why he's asking me to share this. I'm going to be investigating the origins of some of the stigmatized description and depictions of Black Americans in media, and my focal points will be 1845 to 1915, kind of beginning with Douglas's biography in 1845, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, and then kind of ending at what I'm calling the nadir of this effort, the release of Birth of a Nation. The film, the first one, that was horrible depictions of Black Americans during the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction, which played completely into this notion that Black people in government were a significant issue and problem for us going forward, when we know that was not the case. So there's a whole lot more pieces to that puzzle. And Dr. Park, if you want me to mention anything specifically, I will. But in a nutshell, I was going to do this thing that focused on Black folks in media, Black Americans in media, in a more presentist form, kind of vis-a-vis my master's thesis, which kind of spoke on the Black exploitation era in Hollywood. It was a missed opportunity to present Black Americans in a more fully realized way, and it became exploitative. But what I realized is if I start in a more presentist time, I'm going to be consumed in a cell with a generalized Blackness, one that I'm trying to push back against. I'm about the specificity of the Black Americans who descended from the institution of slavery in this country. That is not to exclude or dismiss any others, but it is to highlight and be specific in who we're talking about, because there's a group here that was harmed by this institution, that was harmed by Jim Crow. And this is all mass immigration of people with melanated skin. They endured, and we often ignore and just don't pay enough attention from a specific way that, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment are connected to those people. And when I look at this history, I said, you know what, I need to go back so that I can have this argument solidified. And if I go forward in this, I'll be able to lean on this research and on this dissertation. So it's titled Forging a New Public Image, Representation and Black Intellectuals in the Second Founding, 1845 to 1915. So there's a level of specificity that has eluded many a scholar. And I think this is worthwhile in unpacking and recalibrating the way we frame the Black American experience. I'll leave that there.
Okay, thanks. I think Courtney's hand was up, Annie.
Yeah, Courtney. Well, I think did you say what?
Oh, I said my piece.
Oh, I thought your hand was, no, it was Beverly's hand. I'm sorry. It was Beverly's hand.
Yeah, I had my hand up. I wanted to comment on Mr. Foushie's comment, and that I agree. It's hypocrisy. And for me, it takes me back to what I said originally about Reconstruction. I think it was failure by design. I think a lot of what we've seen has been, we'll kind of pretend that we're doing something, but not really do what we say we're going to do. And a prime example, and Dr. Parker, you have to remind me how long the whole notion of 40 acres and a mule was in place. Was it 2 days, 3 days?
Never, never a day.
People were starting to stake out their property, and they had federal officers and soldiers come to these people's homes and say, sorry, we didn't mean it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's been the whole thing. And I think what we see now is the same thing, just more open. I mean, you can say all the horrible things you want to about Trump, but one good thing you can say is that he'll say whatever's on his mind at the time, and you have no question about whatever he's thinking at the time.
Yeah.
To bring it back to the book, Williams says at the end, she says, African Americans who lived through Reconstruction's revolutionary reforms looked back on this era as one of both remarkable achievement and astonishing betrayal.
Yeah.
And I just feel like, reading this and reading W.E.B. Du Bois's kind of seminal work on Black Reconstruction in America, you read it and it just explains kind of why we are where we are today, and how far we've come, but also how little ways we've come. I mean, it's, we do obviously have freedoms and amendments and all sorts of stuff, but then there's the fact that we have a president today who can say that he feels that he can now reinterpret the 14th Amendment. And then it goes, reinterpreting that amendment to apply to immigration. So what does that mean for Black people?
Yeah.
Because if you reinterpret that, then does that then take away citizenship for people that applied to a generation ago? I mean, so there are all these unintended kind of, or maybe intended consequences with all of this. And reading this book and reading about Reconstruction, there's just so much that it's like, oh, this is why we're all still a mess.
Gerald's hand is up.
Oh,
Gerald's hand is up.
Hey, Gerald.
Yeah, I am on the side of Courtney. I think that nobody can explain kind of what's happening right now because I think it's hate is blinds us so much so that we would sacrifice our own self interest. For example, with this legislation, where we're seeing people are going to be hurt, and rather than oppose that legislation, they're going to go with somebody, and I can't explain it any other way. That you're just so blind through hate, I think, and they're using that for their purposes, and reminds you of what we saw in Germany. So we're in trouble.
yeah. I'll say, just not to be flippant or insensitive, I want to make sure this is clear. The amendments that were made, including the 14th about citizenship, they were understood to be for the specific group of people.
Yeah.
Now, the meandering that takes place and the lack of protections that remain after that kind of mysteriously, or they mystify those amendments in a way that is detrimental to the folks who were here when they were actually activated. And then we reach a point where birthright citizenship absorbs the idea of coming to the country and having a child, when that was just meant to cover these people, these millions of people who had children here. And it was understood, hey, we don't know how else to fix this besides say, if these people, these enslaved people who were born here, are able to be covered, in this amendment, which affords them some measure of protection and at that time a minimal understanding of citizenship, which citizenship was still in question at that time across the board. But I put into the chat for people that are interested and have access. Something I'm very critical of things that come out in the form of media that deal with history first and foremost, but also that deal with Black American plight. But that show was very, very much very well done and very, very well received by myself. It's called Manhunt. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it was on Apple TV, and it's about the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth after his the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But it covers a good portion of what was taking place in that period of time in regards to Reconstruction, in regards to Lincoln's progress on certain matters. But it also speaks about the conspiracies that were going on and the funding, as Dr. Parker mentioned earlier, which is just, when you think about, again, that oligarchical tendency of our country, you get to see some of the people who were playing in terms of their influence with money and who they were funding and how some of these conspiracies were being financed. So it's really well done. I definitely don't recommend a lot of things, but I recommend that one. It really was well constructed. So if you guys have the ability, check out that Manhunt miniseries.
My husband and I watched it as well, and it's really, really good. It's incredible, like you said, it's incredibly well done. And if people are also interested in kind of the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth and the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln, the movie The Conspirator, it came out in 2010. It focuses on the Mary Surratt, who is the first female to ever be executed by the federal government. It's also really good. James McAvoy is in it. But it talks about the conspiracy and a little bit more about Booth's kind of personal life. Courtney, you have your hand up.
Yeah, actually, I'll just jump in and say I believe Robert Redford directed that it was his project. So you don't you have to double check me on that. But I did want to say, just in a self-promotional mode, is that going back to Reconstruction and creating the permanent exhibit for the museum, and it's nice to hear your presentation about this book, because that is the approach that I used when covering, what was Reconstruction like here in Orange County, is that on the one hand, there were great strides forward. Yet on the other hand, there was tremendous backlash. And, just in the few panels that you have, it don't have the time to get into the motivations and all of the reasons, the cause effect for why this happened, just looking and recording what happened, but thought that it was very important to point out both sides, in terms of, because it would be wrong to ignore either one, that and maybe the changes seem more subtle looking back at it from the 21st century. But I believe that for the people who were living through it, yeah, didn't get your 40 acres and a mule. Eric Foner wrote the book Nothing But Freedom, but how important freedom was, and lack of hope, despair, no encouragement. It's difficult to go on, and yet the power of, at least, I used to do a lot of living history types of things, sort of fell into it against my will when it came to the Civil War. And you get all these Confederate yahoos saying these horrible things to school groups about, well, the slaves were better off than the free blacks in the North because, at least they had food and clothing. And I would try to redirect the conversation to, well, why might freedom be important? And so, there are these things to consider as well.
Annie, a question for, well, a comment, I guess, is that you mentioned the sources that Professor Williams used. I think the first thing that I do when I pick up a book is to look at the notes.
Yep.
That tells me a whole lot about,
like a true historian,
where we're going, where anybody's taking us. But I was really impressed with the kinds of sources she used. The book is primarily made up of primary sources.
Yeah, they are.
That is it. Can you say just a little bit more about your impression? For example, I was the Freedmen's Bureau. They did a lot of good things, and one of the things they did was to actually, for all of the southern states, for 11 states, they kept records of what they called outrages against the freedmen. And when you look at North Carolina, and the good thing about it is this stuff has been digitized, so you can go out and see quite a bit of see a number of those atrocities. But for example, they did a pretty good job on North Carolina between 1866 and about 1870, and including what happened not very far from where I am right now. I think Graham is located right between where Gerald and I live. I'm about 5 miles from it. He's probably 4 or 5 miles from it. But what happened to Wyatt Outlaw in February of 1870, and then just a few months later, his friend John W. Stevens was killed up in Caswell County. But I remember Moore County, for example, standing out because the report indicated that a group of individuals, not the Ku Klux Klan, and many of these atrocities that were committed are committed by neighbors.
Yeah.
They're committed not by organized bands, organized groups. Much of what happened across the South after 1865, all the way down to now, it's not an organized band. These are your neighbors. These are individuals. But this group of guys went into this cabin where Black folks lived, mother, father, and about 5 children. And they went in and slaughtered everybody there. And they talked about the fact that they're bragging about the fact that they actually kicked the life out of an infant. And but the report also contained information about who those individuals were. And in most of the cases, we don't know who they were. We don't. The other thing is that nobody was ever, for the most part, nobody was ever arrested, convicted, and sentenced for these outrages or atrocities that occurred. But I was really impressed with Professor Williams's just huge body of evidence. I mean, that's the thing about writing a book, a historical book, a dissertation or master's thesis. It's all about evidence. If you don't have the evidence, then you can't produce it. And so this huge body of evidence is what impressed me most about the book. And
I was impressed that she had so many firsthand accounts from the time period. I mean, some of the issue with the WPA narratives is that these are people recollecting, from 60, 70 years ago. And some of them were very small children at the time of emancipation. And so I was really impressed with the people who were, they went in front of Congress in 1871. And so these are events that they are testifying about that happened to them maybe a month ago, maybe 6 months ago, maybe a year ago. So I was really impressed with how recent her sources were. I will say one thing that I did want. So I really liked how she kind of changed the lens and kind of reoriented this within violence against the Black community. But what I also wanted, and I did like how she talked about, she opens it with this discussion of what freedom looks like and how Black families were kind of how they moved to freedom. In terms of what that looked like for them. The one thing I did really want is I really wish that there was a bit more context in terms of, I would have loved to have known if, were some of these spikes in violence, did that coordinate or coincide with anything going on with the federal government? Like, was there, something like a law that had been passed, or did the passage of the 15th Amendment, did you see a spike? Like I also wanted, my own critique would just be that I wanted a little bit more of the personal stories to coincide with the context of what was happening. Like I wanted a little bit more of, what names of politicians and kind of what was actively going on in this timeline while all this is happening. Because this is horrifying. I mean, I wish I could say that I was surprised. I was not. I've read many stories like these accounts, but it is horrifying and hard to digest. But I do wish that there had been a little bit more context in terms of, the bigger scale, and did any of these spikes in violence or kind of a decrease in violence, did any of that coincide like with kind of what was going on nationally? Beverly, you have your hand up.
Yes, I can't let Dr. Parker's comment about stomping a baby pass without mentioning, everything here in the United States from the time that I'm aware of, that John Lawson and Richard Trotner was traveling through Virginia to North Carolina to find more places for colonists to settle. the whole topic has been about Christianity and being Christian and civilized, making people civilized. Yet we find the people who hold themselves out as the more religious, the better people doing these just horrific things without any consciousness about it, full impunity. And I mean, I just have to say it because it's true. It was happening then in the 1700s and it's continuing to happen today. And I remember seeing something online from one of the Cherokee kin that said, you know, it's so interesting that you, white man, taught us Christianity. We exercise it and you still haven't figured it out. And you know, it's just, as Horace would say, mind numbing. That's all I can say.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah,
And
and
I'm
who
glad,
would do
I'm
that
glad
to an innocent baby? What did a baby do?
Oh,
right.
shameful.
Let
I'm
me
glad.
let me say this right quick, Horace and Beverly. You know, the way of life, and Mona and I've been talking about this, was based on you know the institution of slavery, right, which lasted generations, generations. That we are inferior, and can we ascribe that to hate? I don't know if we can or we can't. That's debatable, but you know, we're in a situation where everything you said is based on you being inferior, even though you got a religion that says different, right? So it's going to be real difficult for a for reconstruction to take place when you have gone generations of being superior to people that you're now trying to make equal. So that's just a pipe dream if you think that's going to go over well. And so here we are today dealing with these same issues of race, and I'm gonna ascribe it to be hate. That's all I can say. I'll go back to what no, it's that superiority. And that superiority, and that superiority.
And unbelievably, if you talk about this modern day Klan, but if you say modern day, you got to go to the Protestants in 1915, who, for their own religious reasons, wanted to be the superior beings on the planet, or at least in this country. But that too was formulated based out of a religion. So how you interpret the Bible is purely up to the people who want it to work for them. And like I said, I don't see any. I'm not a negative person, but the only way out of this is it's going to be a whole bunch of people that have to come together to go against this Trump administration and all these other people. I don't know any way out of it. It makes me think about the philosophy of Malcolm X, by any means necessary. What was he saying when he said that? What was he thinking? Did he already know that no matter how far we go, no matter what we do, things are going to remain the same? It seems like he did.
Well, I just raised my hand to add into it, sort of taking it in a larger direction. I've been doing a lot of reading and research because we're planning this celebration for the Third Provincial Congress, and we've got the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and of course, looking into ideas of freedom and equality. And was reading back and looking at some of these, you know, white men who we call the founding fathers, and the hypocrisy there on the things that they said about equality. And it was very interesting to see that in that early period, after we have won the American Revolution and we're operating under the Articles of Confederation, and these men get together and decide that the Articles aren't working and we need a whole new government, and they write the Constitution and then have to get it ratified. And John Adams, in the, you know, he was one of the loudest voices for independence and freedom and equality, and he, you know, as far as my readings on him go, you know, there was no slavery, he wanted to, if he could have abolished it, he would have back then. But by the time you get to the Constitution, all of his idealism is pretty much gone. And he said, I thought, Americans were exceptional. I thought we in our country, all believed in equality and no aristocracy. But what we really want, everybody just wants to be better than. And the only thing we want in terms of equality is to make sure that we have access to be better than. We don't want to be equal. We just want an equal chance to be better than you. And I thought that was an interesting thing that he was writing about and looking at people in general, the American condition, and what people really think about equality.
Let me just say, Annie, you mentioned Ulysses S. Grant, and of course, he was the one. The enforcement acts were passed under him in 1870 and 1871. But I think one agency that we don't talk about enough, and I really wish that a master's student would take on this task of looking at the DOJ, the Department of Justice was established in 1870, just before those legislative hearings took place in 1870, 1871. The DOJ was actually in the forefront of ensuring that people came in to actually testify. And by the time 1871 comes to an end, 1872 rolls around. I can't think of the name of the first official, but he was so upset with what the government wasn't doing that he just resigned. And essentially the DOJ didn't do anything positive, after that Reconstruction period, didn't do anything positive with regard to civil rights until we come to 1957. And then it takes off and does some things, as all of you know, during the 1960s. And now it has devolved into something that is akin to what happened during the 1870s. The Department of Justice, which of course allowed for the creation of Civil Rights Division. Civil Rights Division in the government is dead now for the most part. Absolutely dead. All of those cases that they were looking at, they decided that no longer are we going to look at those. The attorneys that were hired to prosecute those cases have been fired. And but I just wish a student would take a look. I just have not seen anything on the DOJ and civil rights, between 1870 and say 2025.
Dr. Park, I just wanted to add, I placed a book in the chat if you're familiar or interested. It's a compact read, but it does a great job of breaking down the theological schism concerning slavery leading up to the Civil War and the argument for slavery using the Bible and Christianity, and the argument against slavery using the Bible and Christianity. So it's worthy of engagement.
I see Brenda has Jesus and John Wayne. I don't think I heard of that one.
I put that in because we were talking about the overlap with this, white nationalist movement and the Christian nationalist movements. And Jesus and John Wayne just is a good book that kind of tells you how we got here.
Oh, okay.
How you get to the Christian nationalism that we are seeing today. The other one is called Preparing for War, and that's another good one that talks about the link between white supremacy and Christianity. That's a very interesting topic for me. I wanted to do something with that for my thesis because I'm just drawn to it for some reason. But yeah, those books were pretty good.
So Brandy, y'all, is everything white supremacy. So in a month or so, she knows it in, out, up, down. So in about a month or so, well, I'll surely let you know that she's going to be presenting on white supremacy in Person County, North Carolina, Roxborough. Probably near the end of July, but you'll get that information. Annie, anything else you want to put on the table, bring before the council?
No, I just want to thank you guys for attending and participating this evening, joining me. Freddie, thank you for asking me to lead this discussion.
Thank you for doing an outstanding job. Absolutely. And especially I like that that review of Reconstruction. I had to write a few things down.
You should have jumped in with anything I got wrong.
No, you're good to go. Any other comments from anybody?
Oh, God, shut up.
I hate to step on the ending, but do you have a second to hang around, Dr. Parker? Just a second.
Yeah, surely.
Good seeing all you guys again. Talk to you soon.
Nice to
All
see
right,
you.
so I'll let you know when the next one comes up, probably in about a month or so. Okay.
All righty.
Y'all
All
take
right,
care.
everybody.
Take care, Andy.
now.
Good job.
Great job. Yeah, you're still in your meeting, Felton, or you're out of that one?
I'm out of that one. I just had to vote on the budget, so that was quick and painless. I see somebody still on, but I don't know.
Let me stop the recording for one thing.